The scream of a mountain lion echoed through the canyon, but Isaac Whitmore barely flinched as he skinned the elk he had just brought down with a single shot. Blood covered his massive forearms, muscles rippling beneath sun-darkened skin as he worked the blade with practiced efficiency. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tangled with bits of pine needles and dust from 3 weeks in the high country above Hangtown, California. It was June of 1867, and Isaac had not spoken to another human soul in nearly 2 months, which suited him just fine. The wilderness was all he needed, all he understood, all he trusted after the war had torn everything else away from him. He loaded the meat onto his pack mule and began the descent toward the settlement, not because he craved company, but because his supply of coffee and ammunition had run dangerously low. The trail wound through thick stands of ponderosa pine and granite outcroppings, the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy in golden shafts that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Isaac moved with the silent grace of a predator despite his considerable size, every step deliberate and sure. That was when he saw her. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that perhaps the solitude had finally addled his brain the way it did to some men who spent too long alone in the mountains. But as he drew closer, squinting against the dappled sunlight, he realized the vision was real. A woman sat beneath an enormous oak tree, her back resting against the trunk, completely absorbed in a book held delicately in her hands. Her dress was a pale blue calico, practical but clean, and her honey-colored hair was pinned up in a style that suggested she came from town, not from the rough mining camps that dotted the foothills. Isaac froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle strapped to his back. Women were rare in these parts, and a woman alone in the wilderness was practically unheard of. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Was she lost? Injured? Running from something? He took a step closer, a twig snapping under his boot despite his caution. Her head jerked up, eyes wide with alarm, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with clear hazel eyes that held intelligence and something else, something that made Isaac's chest tighten in a way he had not felt in years. Fear flickered across her face as she took in his appearance, the blood on his hands, the weapons, the wild look of a man who belonged more to the mountains than to civilization. "I do not mean you any harm," Isaac said, his voice rough from disuse, each word feeling strange and clumsy in his mouth. He held up his hands, showing her his palms, though they were still stained crimson from his work. She clutched the book to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white against the leather binding. "I am quite all right, thank you. I am simply resting before I return to town." Her voice was cultured, educated, with a softness that made Isaac acutely aware of his own rough appearance and the sharp tang of blood and sweat that clung to him. He noticed her eyes darting past him, searching for others, probably hoping he was not alone. "Town is 5 miles that way," Isaac said, gesturing down the trail. "You are heading the wrong direction." Color flooded her cheeks and she looked down at the book in her hands. "I am afraid I became rather lost in my reading. I did not notice how far I had wandered." Isaac glanced at the sky, calculating the angle of the sun. "You have maybe 2 hours before dark. These woods are not safe for a woman alone, especially after sunset. Mountain lions, bears, and worse." "Worse?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men," Isaac said flatly. "Some of the prospectors in these hills would not think twice about taking advantage of a woman alone." She paled but lifted her chin with a defiance that surprised him. "I am perfectly capable of finding my own way back, sir. I thank you for your concern, but I require no assistance." Isaac studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to avoid human contact and something else, something deeper that urged him to protect this foolish, brave woman who sat reading under trees in the wilderness. Finally, he nodded once and began to turn away. "Wait," she called out, and he paused. "I am sorry. That was terribly rude of me. You startled me and I spoke without thinking. My name is Helena Hughes. I am the new schoolteacher in Hangtown." Isaac turned back slowly. "Isaac Whitmore, I live in the mountains." "Clearly," Helena said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice that made something warm unfurl in Isaac's chest. She stood, brushing off her skirts, and he was struck by how small she seemed, how delicate compared to the rough landscape surrounding them. The book remained clutched in her hand, and Isaac found his eyes drawn to it. "What are you reading?" he asked, the question surprising himself as much as it appeared to surprise her. Helena glanced down at the book, then back up at him, her expression softening. "Jane Eyre. Have you read it?" Isaac felt heat creep up his neck, a sensation he had not experienced since he was a boy. "I cannot read," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was not something he had ever been ashamed of before, but looking at this woman with her book and her education and her cultured voice, he felt the weight of his ignorance like a stone around his neck. Something shifted in Helena's expression, the wariness replaced by genuine interest. "Not at all. I know some letters. My ma taught me a few before she died, but that was 20 years ago. Never had much use for it in the mountains." Isaac shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the conversation but unwilling to walk away. Helena looked at him thoughtfully, then down at her book, then back at him again. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I could teach you if you would like. Reading, I mean. It is what I do, after all." Isaac's immediate instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude where no one could see his weaknesses or his failures. But something in Helena's eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine kindness, made him hesitate. "I will walk you back to town," he said instead, dodging the offer. "It is not safe for you out here alone." Helena nodded, accepting his deflection with grace. "I would appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore, though I assure you I am not usually so careless." The book simply captured my attention, and I lost track of time and direction. They began walking, Isaac leading his pack mule loaded with elk meat, Helena walking beside him with her book tucked under her arm. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, though Isaac was hyper-aware of her presence in a way that made him feel clumsy and oversized. He towered over her by at least a foot, his shoulders twice as broad as hers, and he found himself consciously trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. "What is the book about?" he asked after they had walked for perhaps a mile, surprising himself again with his curiosity. Helena's face lit up, and she launched into an explanation of the story, her hands moving expressively as she talked about orphans and cruel guardians, and a mysterious man named Mr. Rochester. Isaac understood maybe half of what she said, but he found himself mesmerized by the passion in her voice, the way her entire being seemed to come alive when she talked about the words on those pages. "You truly love it," he observed. "Reading, I mean." "More than anything," Helena admitted. "Books have been my constant companion since I was a child. They take you places you could never go, show you lives you could never live, teach you things you could never otherwise know. They are like magic in a way." Isaac thought about this as they walked, about the weight of knowledge contained in those thin pages, about all the things that existed in the world that he knew nothing about. For the first time in his life, he felt the lack of that knowledge as a genuine loss rather than simply a fact of his existence. "Why did you come to Hangtown?" he asked. "It is rough country, not fit for a woman with your education." Helena was quiet for a moment, her expression turning serious. "My father was a teacher back in Boston. He believed education was the right of every person, regardless of their station in life. When he died last year, I decided to honor his memory by bringing that belief west, to places where education is scarce and children grow up without ever learning to read or write." "That is noble," Isaac said, and he meant it. "Dangerous, but noble. Is it so very dangerous?" Helena asked, glancing at him. "Hangtown seems relatively civilized. There is a sheriff, a church, several businesses." Isaac made a non-committal sound. "Hangtown earned its name for a reason. There is law, yes, but justice is often swift and brutal. And the mining camps in the hills, those are a different matter entirely. Men go mad out there, searching for gold that is not there, drinking away what little they find. They would see a woman like you as something to take, not to protect." Helena shivered despite the warmth of the afternoon. "You paint a grim picture, Mr. Whitmore. I paint an honest one. This is not Boston." Isaac paused, then added more gently, "But the town itself is safe enough, especially with the sheriff keeping order, and the children need a teacher. You will do good work there." They continued in silence for a while, the trail widening as they descended toward the valley, where Hangtown sprawled along the creek that had once promised gold, and now offered only mud and broken dreams. Isaac found himself slowing his pace, reluctant for the walk to end, though he could not have explained why if someone had asked him. "Your offer," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "To teach me to read, does it still stand?" Helena stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. "Of course it does. I meant it sincerely. I do not come to town often, maybe once a month for supplies. Then we shall make the most of those visits," Helena said firmly. "Or, if you prefer, I could come out to wherever you make your camp. I do enjoy walks in the wilderness, obviously, though I shall endeavor to keep better track of my direction in the future." Isaac felt his heart hammering in his chest, a sensation both alarming and exhilarating. "I have a cabin about 3 miles north of town, up in the foothills. It is rough, not fit for visitors, especially not ladies. I am a teacher, Mr. Whitmore, not a delicate flower. I assure you I have weathered far worse than a rough cabin." Helena's smile was warm, genuine, and Isaac felt something inside him crack open, something he had kept locked away since the war. "Isaac," he said quietly, "you can call me Isaac, then you must call me Helena." They reached the outskirts of Hangtown as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town was a collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents, some permanent structures showing the ambition of those who believed the settlement would last, others temporary shelters for those still chasing the dream of easy riches. The main street was a river of mud from the spring runoff, and the sound of piano music and rough laughter drifted from the saloons that lined both sides. Isaac walked Helena to the small schoolhouse at the far end of town, a tidy building with a small room attached at the back that served as the teacher's quarters. He was acutely aware of the stares they received, the mountain man covered in blood and buckskin walking beside the refined schoolteacher in her calico dress. He knew how it looked, knew there would be talk, but for once he found he did not care. "Thank you for ensuring my safe return," Helena said when they reached her door. "I am in your debt, Isaac." "No debt," Isaac said gruffly. "Just be more careful. These mountains are not forgiving of mistakes." "I shall, and Isaac." She waited until he met her eyes. "I meant what I said about the reading lessons. Come by whenever you are able. I am usually here in the afternoons after school lets out." Isaac nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture he had seen other men make, then turned and walked away, leading his pack mule toward the mercantile to sell his elk meat and buy his supplies. But his mind was not on coffee or ammunition. It was on hazel eyes and honey-colored hair, and the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something worth coming down from the mountains for after all. Over the next week, Isaac found excuses to ride into town 3 separate times. He told himself it was necessary, that he needed nails for repairs on his cabin, that his coffee supply was lower than he thought, that he wanted to check if the mercantile had received any new knives. But the truth, which he could barely admit even to himself, was that he wanted to see Helena again. Each time he rode past the schoolhouse, he heard her voice through the open windows, patient and kind as she worked with the dozen or so children whose families had scraped together enough to keep them in school rather than working the claims or helping with the endless chores that frontier life demanded. He listened to her teaching letters and numbers, her voice never rising in anger even when the students struggled, and he found himself drawn to that patience, that gentleness that seemed so foreign to everything he had known. On his 4th visit, he finally worked up the courage to knock on her door. It was late afternoon, the students having departed an hour earlier, and he clutched his hat in his hands like a shield as he waited for her to answer. When she opened the door, her face broke into a genuine smile that made his heart stutter. "Isaac, I am so glad to see you. I was beginning to worry you had changed your mind." "I have been busy," he said, which was not entirely a lie. "Cabin repairs, hunting, the usual." "Of course," Helena said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please come in. I was just making tea. Would you care for some?" Isaac ducked through the doorway, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. The room was simple but tidy, with a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves lined with books. So many books. More books than Isaac had ever seen in one place, their spines creating a rainbow of colors against the plain wooden walls. "You have a lot of books," he observed, unable to keep the awe from his voice. "My most prized possessions," Helena said, moving to the small stove where a kettle was beginning to whistle. "Each one a doorway to a different world. Would you like to see them?" Isaac approached the shelves cautiously, as if the books might bite. He reached out to touch one spine, running his calloused finger over the embossed letters. "What does this one say?" Helena came to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell lavender and something else, something uniquely her. "That is 2 Years Before the Mast by Richard Henry Dana. It is about sailing ships and adventure on the ocean." "I have never seen the ocean," Isaac admitted. "Neither have I, not really. I saw the harbor in Boston as a child, but that hardly counts. But through this book, I have sailed around Cape Horn and seen the coast of California when it was still wild and untamed." She pulled the book from the shelf and opened it, showing him pages covered in lines of mysterious symbols that meant nothing to him, but apparently contained entire worlds for those who could decipher them. Isaac stared at the pages, feeling again that strange mix of shame and longing. "Will you teach me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Helena said simply, no hesitation, no judgment. "Sit down and we shall begin." They sat at the small table and Helena produced a slate and chalk. She began with the alphabet, speaking each letter clearly and writing it out for him to see. Isaac watched her hands as she formed the shapes, elegant fingers handling the chalk with the same care she had held her book that first day under the oak tree. "A," she said, drawing the letter. "This is the first letter, the beginning of everything." Isaac took the chalk from her, his large hand dwarfing hers as their fingers brushed. He tried to replicate the shape she had made, but his lines were shaky, uncertain. His hands, so sure with a rifle or a knife, seemed clumsy and stupid with the chalk. "That is very good," Helena encouraged. "Try again and make the lines meet at the top." They worked for an hour, Isaac struggling through the first several letters of the alphabet while Helena corrected and encouraged in equal measure. His fingers became cramped from gripping the chalk too hard, and his head ached from the concentration, but he persisted. When Helena finally called a halt, saying his brain needed rest, Isaac felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment mixed with frustration at how much he still did not know. "You are a quick learner," Helena said, washing the slate clean. "Most adults struggle far more with their first lesson." "I feel stupid as a stone," Isaac muttered. "You are not stupid. You simply never had the opportunity to learn. There is a vast difference." Helena's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "Learning to read as an adult is one of the hardest things a person can do. The fact that you are willing to try shows considerable courage." Isaac looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the warmth in her eyes. "Why do you care?" he asked. "Whether I learn or not, I mean. You do not know me." Helena was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling on the slate. "My father used to say that education was the greatest gift one person could give another, that by teaching someone to read, you opened the entire world to them. He taught anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their age or station. I suppose I see it the same way. Everyone deserves that gift, including mountain men who live alone in the wilderness." "I am not alone," Isaac said, then realized how that sounded. "I mean, I have my mule, and I see people sometimes when I come to town." Helena's lips quirked in amusement. "Your mule must be excellent company." "Better than most people," Isaac said, and was rewarded with her laugh, a sound like water over stones, clear and bright. He left as the sun began to set, promising to return in a week for another lesson. As he rode back up into the mountains, his mind was full of letters and the way Helena's eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. He had not felt this unsettled since he was a young man, before the war, before he learned that trust and hope were luxuries that got men killed. But Helena was different. She looked at him without fear, without judgment, as if he were a person worth knowing rather than a wild thing to be avoided. And against all his better instincts, against everything he had learned about keeping his distance and protecting his heart, Isaac found himself wanting to be the man he saw reflected in her eyes. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Isaac would ride down from his cabin twice a week, timing his visits for when Helena's students had gone home. They would sit at her small table, and she would guide him through the mysteries of reading, her patience seemingly endless as he struggled with words that seemed to shift and change every time he looked at them. Some days were better than others. On good days, he could sound out simple words and feel the thrill of understanding. On bad days, the letters swam before his eyes and he wanted to throw the slate across the room in frustration. Helena never lost her temper, never made him feel small for his struggles. Instead, she would adjust her approach, find new ways to explain and celebrate even the smallest victories with genuine joy. And slowly, painfully, Isaac began to read. But the reading lessons were only part of why Isaac found himself drawn back to town again and again. He began to notice small things about Helena, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the furrow that appeared between her brows when she concentrated, the musical quality of her laugh. He noticed how she always had a kind word for the ragged children who came to her school, how she never turned anyone away even when their parents could not pay, how she mended their clothes and filled their bellies with what little she had. He began bringing her things from the mountains, gifts he told himself were simply practical. Fresh venison so she would not have to survive on the meager supplies she could afford. Pine nuts he had gathered, wildflowers that caught his eye. Once, a perfect eagle feather he had found on a high ridge. Helena accepted each offering with delight, treating his rough gifts as if they were precious treasures. "You do not have to bring me things," she told him one afternoon as she arranged the wildflowers in a chipped teacup filled with water. "I know," Isaac said, "but I want to." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something that made Isaac's breath catch and Helena's cheeks flush pink. The air in the small room seemed to thicken, charged with possibility, and for a moment Isaac thought about closing the distance between them, about finding out if her lips were as soft as they looked. But he did not. He was dirty and rough, marked by violence and hardship, while she was educated and refined, a woman who read poetry and spoke of things he barely understood. What could he possibly offer someone like her beyond wild game and awkward company? "Tell me about the war," Helena said one afternoon, months into their lessons. Isaac had progressed to reading simple sentences now, though complex passages still defeated him. They had taken a break from the slate, and Helena had made tea, a ritual he had come to treasure. Isaac stiffened, his jaw clenching. "There is nothing to tell, Isaac." Helena's voice was gentle but firm. "I have told you about my life, my family, my dreams, but you remain a mystery. You do not have to tell me if you truly do not wish to, but I would like to know you better." Isaac stared into his tea, watching the dark liquid swirl in the cup. He had not spoken of the war to anyone, had tried his best to bury those memories deep where they could not touch him. But sitting in Helena's warm kitchen, surrounded by her books and her kindness, he found the words spilling out despite himself. "I was 17 when I joined up," he began, his voice rough. "Thought it would be an adventure, a chance to prove myself. My father had died the year before, and my mother 2 years before that. I had nothing keeping me in Missouri, so I signed up with the Union Army and headed east." Helena listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. It was not an adventure. It was hell. "Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. I saw things no man should see, did things that still wake me in the night. By the time it ended, I was 21 years old and felt 100. Everyone I had joined up with was dead. Everyone I had come to care about was gone, so I walked away. Kept walking until I hit the mountains, and I have been here ever since." "I am sorry," Helena said quietly. "No one should have to carry those burdens alone." "I am not alone," Isaac said, attempting to lighten the mood. "I have my mule, remember." But Helena did not smile. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her skin soft and warm against his calloused palm. "You do not have to be alone, Isaac. Not if you do not want to be." Isaac looked at their joined hands, at the stark contrast between her delicate fingers and his scarred, roughened skin. He should pull away, should maintain the distance he had carefully constructed between himself and the rest of humanity. But he did not. Instead, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, holding on as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "Helena," he said, his voice barely audible, "I am not the kind of man who deserves a woman like you. I am rough and uneducated and half wild. You could have anyone, any proper gentleman who could give you the life you deserve." "And what if I do not want a proper gentleman?" Helena asked, her eyes bright and fierce. "What if I want a man who brings me wildflowers and hunts deer and struggles through reading lessons because I asked him to? What if I want a man who is brave enough to be vulnerable, who treats me as an equal rather than a delicate ornament to be protected and controlled?" Isaac's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have come to care for you, Isaac Whitmore, deeply. And unless I am very much mistaken, you have come to care for me as well. I do, Isaac admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. God help me, Helena, I do. I think about you every moment I am in the mountains. I come down from my cabin far more often than I need to because I cannot bear to go too long without seeing you. But I do not know how to be what you need. I do not know how to be anything other than what I am. Helena stood and moved around the table to stand before him. Isaac remained seated, which put them nearly at eye level, and she reached up to cup his bearded face in both hands. Then be what you are, because what you are is exactly what I want. She kissed him, and Isaac felt his entire world shift on its axis. Her lips were soft and sure against his, tasting of tea and honey, and after a moment of shocked stillness, he kissed her back. His arms came up to wrap around her waist, pulling her close, and she made a small sound of approval that sent heat racing through his veins. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. I have nothing to offer you, he whispered. A rough cabin in the mountains, a hard life, no luxuries. I do not need luxuries, Helena said firmly. I need you, just you, Isaac. Your strength, your kindness, your determination. That is more than enough. People will talk. A schoolteacher cannot be courting a mountain man. Let them talk. I do not care what anyone thinks. Helena pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Do you want me, Isaac? Truly? More than I have ever wanted anything, he admitted, and it was the truth. Then that is all that matters. They kissed again, slower this time, learning the taste and feel of each other. Isaac was gentle despite his size and strength, treating Helena like something precious and rare. When they finally parted, the sun had set and the room was growing dark. I should light a lamp, Helena said, but made no move to step away from him. I should get back to my cabin, Isaac said, equally reluctant to move. Or you could stay for supper, Helena suggested. I have stew on the stove and we could continue your reading lesson. Isaac smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange and wonderful on his face. I would like that. They spent the evening reading together, Isaac stumbling through passages from a book of simple stories while Helena corrected and encouraged. But now, there was an added dimension to their time together, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with the connection sparking between them. When Isaac finally left, he kissed Helena goodnight on her doorstep, not caring if anyone saw, then rode back up into the mountains with his heart lighter than it had been in years. Over the following months, their relationship deepened. Isaac continued his reading lessons, progressing to more complex books with Helena's patient guidance. He was not a natural reader, and likely never would be, but he persisted because it mattered to her, and because he was beginning to understand the magic she had spoken of that first day, the way words on a page could transport you to places you had never been and teach you things you had never known. But more than the reading, Isaac treasured the time they spent simply being together. He would help Helena with repairs around the schoolhouse, his skilled hands making quick work of tasks that would have taken her days. She would read aloud to him in the evenings, her voice bringing stories to life in ways that his halting reading never could. They would take walks on Sundays after church, which Isaac had started attending despite his discomfort with crowds, because Helena sang in the small choir, and he loved watching her face glow with joy as she lifted her voice. The town gossips had plenty to say about the unlikely pairing of the refined schoolteacher and the rough mountain man, but Helena ignored them with the same grace she showed her most difficult students, and Isaac had never cared what people thought to begin with. What mattered was the way Helena's face lit up when she saw him, the way she fit perfectly against his side when they walked, the way she listened to his halting words with the same attention she gave her books. As autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson, Isaac knew he had to make a decision. He could not keep courting Helena indefinitely without declaring his intentions, and his intentions had become crystal clear. He wanted to marry her, wanted to wake up every morning with her beside him, wanted to build a life together that combined his wilderness and her civilization in some new way that belonged to them alone. But proposing required a ring, and rings required money, which Isaac had precious little of. He lived off the land, trading meat and furs for the few supplies he needed, with rarely any cash to his name. So he began hunting in earnest, taking down elk and deer and even a bear, processing the meat and hides and taking them to town to sell. The mercantile owner, a shrewd man named Wilson, raised his eyebrows at the increased quantity but asked no questions, simply paid Isaac fair prices and wished him well. It took Isaac 3 months to save enough, and by then winter was approaching, the first snows beginning to dust the high peaks. He rode into town on a cold December morning and went to the jeweler, a small shop tucked between the mercantile and the assay office. The proprietor, an older man named Mr. Chen who had come from China during the gold rush, showed Isaac his selection of rings. "For special lady?" Mr. Chen asked, his English accented but clear. "Very special," Isaac confirmed, studying the rings with an intensity usually reserved for tracking game. Most were too delicate, too ornate, not right for Helena's practical hands. But then he saw it. A simple gold band with a small sapphire set in the center, the blue stone the exact color of the dress Helena had been wearing that first day under the oak tree. "That one," he said, pointing. Mr. Chen smiled and pulled out the ring, holding it up to catch the light. "Good choice. Simple but beautiful, like mountain stream, very sturdy." Isaac paid for the ring with the money he had saved, watching as Mr. Chen wrapped it carefully in soft cloth and placed it in a small wooden box. The jeweler's knowing smile suggested he understood exactly what this purchase meant to Isaac, the significance of a man like him buying such a thing. Isaac carried the ring in his pocket for a week, waiting for the right moment. He wanted it to be perfect, wanted to give Helena a proposal worthy of the gift she had given him, by seeing past his rough exterior to the man beneath. Finally, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather was clear and cold, he asked Helena if she would take a walk with him up into the foothills. "It is rather cold," Helena observed, but she was already reaching for her heavy cloak. "I know a place that will be worth it," Isaac promised. They walked together, Isaac leading Helena along trails only he knew, up through stands of pine and oak until they reached a small clearing that overlooked the valley. From here, you could see Hangtown spread out below, smoke rising from 100 chimneys, the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the settlement. Beyond, the mountains stretched to the horizon, peak after peak disappearing into the distance, wild and beautiful and eternal. "Oh, Isaac," Helena breathed, her eyes wide as she took in the view. "This is magnificent." "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Isaac said. "It reminds me that there is more to the world than just my own struggles, that I am part of something bigger." They stood together in silence for a moment, Helena's hand finding his. Then Isaac took a deep breath, his heart hammering, and turned to face her. "Helena, before I met you, I thought I had my life figured out. I thought I wanted solitude and silence, that I was better off alone. But you showed me something different. You showed me that being strong does not mean being isolated, that letting someone in does not make you weak. You made me want to learn, to grow, to be more than I was." Helena's eyes were shining with unshed tears, her grip tightening on his hand. Isaac continued, the words coming easier now. You are the smartest, kindest, bravest woman I have ever known. You came west alone to teach children who needed you, and somehow you saw something worth caring about in a rough mountain man who could barely write his own name. I do not deserve you, and I probably never will, but I am asking anyway. Helena Hughes, will you marry me? He pulled the small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing the ring. Helena gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth, and for a terrible moment Isaac thought she was going to refuse, that he had misread everything, that she wanted his company but not his name. "Yes," Helena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Isaac, of course I will marry you." Relief and joy flooded through Isaac in equal measure. He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and it fit perfectly, the sapphire catching the winter sunlight. Then he pulled Helena into his arms and kissed her, pouring everything he felt into that kiss, all his love and hope and desperate gratitude that she had chosen him. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I do not say it enough, but I do, more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." "I love you too," Helena said, pulling back to look up at him, her smile radiant. "My mountain man who learned to read so he could understand what I loved about books, who brings me wildflowers and venison and eagle feathers, who looks at me like I am the most precious thing in the world." "You are," Isaac said simply. "You are." They stood in the clearing for a long time, holding each other against the cold, making plans for their future. They would marry in the spring, Helena decided, when the wildflowers were blooming and the mountains were at their most beautiful. She would continue teaching, at least for a while, because the children needed her and she loved her work. Isaac would build an addition onto his cabin, making it suitable for a wife, with proper windows and a real floor and enough space for all her books. "I want to make you happy," Isaac said as they finally began the walk back to town. "I do not always know how, but I want to try." "You already make me happy," Helena assured him. "Simply by being yourself, by loving me as I am, that is all I need." The engagement sparked fresh gossip in Hangtown, but neither Isaac nor Helena paid it any mind. They were too busy planning their future, too wrapped up in each other to care what anyone else thought. Helena wore her ring proudly, showing it to her students who oohed and awed appropriately. Some of the town women sniffed disapprovingly, but others, particularly those whose children attended Helena's school, congratulated her warmly. They had seen how Isaac looked at their teacher, had witnessed his devotion, and they knew she had found something rare and precious. Winter deepened, and Isaac worked on his cabin during the short daylight hours, adding rooms and making improvements. Helena came up to visit when the weather allowed, bringing fabric for curtains and kitchen supplies and her beloved books. Together they planned where everything would go, how they would combine their two very different lives into something new. "Are you certain you will be happy up here?" Isaac asked her one afternoon as they stood in the half-finished addition. "It is isolated, far from town and your friends." "My friends are my books and they travel well," Helena said, squeezing his hand. "And I have you. That is more than enough. Besides, I rather like the idea of being the teacher who lives in the mountains. It has a romantic quality to it." Isaac smiled and kissed her temple. "You are the only person I know who would find romance in a rough cabin miles from civilization." "Then you do not know me very well yet," Helena teased. "But you have the rest of our lives to learn, the rest of our lives." Isaac turned those words over in his mind, marveling at them. He had never imagined having a future beyond the next season, the next hunt, the next winter. But with Helena, he could see years stretching ahead, filled with possibility and hope. As winter gave way to spring, the cabin took shape under Isaac's skilled hands. He built sturdy furniture, a large bed frame and a proper table and chairs and shelves for Helena's growing collection of books. He installed a large window in what would be their bedroom, positioning it to catch the morning sun and frame a view of the mountains beyond. Helena contributed curtains and quilts, small touches that transformed the rough cabin into something that felt like a home. They were married on a Sunday in May, when the meadows were carpeted with wildflowers, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine. The ceremony took place in Hangtown's small church, with most of the town in attendance despite the reservations some held about the match. Helena wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Isaac wore new clothes purchased specially for the occasion, his hair trimmed and his beard neatly groomed, though he could do nothing about the calluses on his hands or the scars that marked his arms. But as he stood at the altar and watched Helena walk toward him on the arm of the mercantile owner, Mr. Wilson, who had volunteered to give her away in the absence of her father, Isaac felt like the luckiest man alive. Her smile was radiant, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy, and when she placed her hand in his, Isaac felt something settle deep in his chest, a sense of rightness and belonging he had never experienced before. The minister, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, smiled at them both as he began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Isaac barely heard the words that followed, too focused on Helena's face, on the way she was looking at him like he was something miraculous. When the minister asked if he took Helena to be his lawfully wedded wife, Isaac's "I do" rang clear and strong through the small church. Helena's "I do" was equally firm, no hesitation, no doubt, just absolute certainty that this was right. "I now pronounce you man and wife. Isaac, you may kiss your bride." Isaac cupped Helena's face in his large hands, infinitely gentle, and kissed her as their friends and neighbors applauded. It was a kiss full of promise, of all the tomorrows they would share, of love freely given and gratefully received. The town had arranged a small celebration at the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Isaac endured it all with good grace, though crowds still made him uncomfortable. But seeing Helena's happiness, the way she glowed as she danced and laughed and accepted congratulations, made every awkward moment worthwhile. As the sun began to set, they slipped away from the celebration and rode up into the mountains together, Helena seated in front of Isaac on his large bay horse, her head resting against his chest. The cabin waited for them, transformed by their combined efforts into something more than Isaac had ever imagined it could be. Isaac dismounted first, then lifted Helena down, her skirts billowing around her. But instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up into his arms, carrying her toward the cabin. "What are you doing?" Helena laughed, her arms around his neck. "I read about this," Isaac said, a hint of pride in his voice. "About carrying your bride over the threshold. It is supposed to bring good luck." "You read about it?" Helena's eyes sparkled. "Isaac Whitmore, are you telling me you have been reading wedding customs?" "I wanted to do things right," Isaac admitted, pushing open the door with his shoulder and carrying Helena inside. "You deserve a proper wedding, proper traditions. You are perfect," Helena said, kissing him softly. "Everything about this day has been perfect." Isaac set her down gently, and they stood together in the cabin that was now their home, the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows Isaac had installed, illuminating the books on the shelves and the wildflowers Helena had arranged in jars around the room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitmore," Isaac said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home, Mr. Whitmore," Helena replied, and they both laughed at the strangeness and rightness of their new names. That night, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and care, Isaac treating Helena with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. She showed him that vulnerability was not weakness, that opening your heart to someone was the bravest thing a person could do. And in the warmth of their marriage bed, surrounded by mountains and wildflowers and the endless Montana sky, Isaac finally let go of the last walls he had built around his heart. The months that followed were the happiest of Isaac's life. Helena continued teaching at the school in Hangtown, riding down 3 days a week while Isaac hunted and maintained their home and worked on his reading. He had progressed to the point where he could make his way through most books with only occasional help, and he spent his evenings reading aloud to Helena, his deep voice bringing stories to life in their small cabin. They fell into comfortable routines, the rhythm of married life suiting them both. Helena would rise early to prepare breakfast while Isaac tended to the horses and checked his trap lines. They would eat together, discussing their plans for the day. Then Helena would ride down to town for her teaching while Isaac worked on whatever tasks needed doing. On the days Helena stayed home, they would work side by side, she mending clothes or preparing lessons while he repaired tools or processed game. The isolation that had once defined Isaac's life no longer felt like isolation. With Helena beside him, the cabin felt complete, full of warmth and laughter and love. She brought civilization to the wilderness, not by taming it, but by showing Isaac that you could have both, that you could live close to the land while still treasuring art and literature and learning. As autumn arrived once more, painting the mountains in their annual display of gold and crimson, Helena began showing signs that she was with child. At first, Isaac did not notice, too focused on preparing for winter and ensuring they had enough supplies to last through the cold months. But when Helena quietly mentioned that she would need to stop riding down to town soon, that the journey was becoming too difficult, understanding dawned. "You are pregnant," he said, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "I am," Helena confirmed, placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "The baby should arrive in the spring, around April if my calculations are correct." Isaac felt his knees go weak, and he sat down heavily on the nearest chair. A baby. Their baby. The idea filled him with terror and joy in equal measure. What did he know about being a father? His own father had died when he was young, and the war had taken what little innocence and gentleness remained in him. How could he possibly raise a child? "Isaac," Helena's voice was concerned. "Are you all right? I know this is sudden, but I thought you would be pleased." "I am," Isaac managed, looking up at her. "I am pleased, Helena. Terrified, but pleased. What if I am not a good father? What if I cannot protect you both? What if something happens during the birth?" Helena crossed to him and cupped his face in her hands, the gesture so familiar now, so perfectly them. "You will be an excellent father because you care enough to worry about being a good one. And as for the birth, women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." "You cannot know that," Isaac said, his voice rough. He had seen too much death, knew too well how quickly life could be stolen away. "No, I cannot," Helena admitted. "But I choose to have faith, and I need you to have faith as well. Can you do that for me?" Isaac pulled her into his lap, holding her close, burying his face in her hair. "I will try, for you I will try." True to her word, Helena stopped making the journey to Hangtown as autumn deepened into winter. The school board was understanding, arranging for a temporary replacement until Helena could return after the baby was born. Isaac was secretly relieved to have her home full-time, where he could watch over her and ensure she did not overexert herself. Winter was long and harsh that year, with heavy snows that sometimes kept them inside the cabin for days at a time. But Isaac had prepared well, and they had plenty of supplies. They spent the long evenings reading together, Helena's hands resting on her growing belly as Isaac stumbled through passages from books he never would have attempted a year earlier. Sometimes he would read to her belly, talking to the baby about the mountains and the animals and the life they would share. "You think it is a boy or a girl?" Helena asked one night as they lay in bed, her back against Isaac's chest, his large hand spread protectively over her swollen stomach. "I do not care," Isaac said honestly. "As long as you are both healthy, nothing else matters." "I think it is a boy," Helena said. "I do not know why, but I have this feeling. A strong boy like his father, with your courage and your kindness. And your intelligence," Isaac added. "And your love of books." "A mountain man who reads," Helena laughed. "What a combination!" The baby kicked, and Isaac felt it against his palm, a sensation so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Life. New life. A piece of Helena and a piece of him combined into something entirely new. The responsibility of it was overwhelming, but so was the love he already felt for this child he had not yet met. As winter slowly released its grip and spring began to creep back into the mountains, Helena grew larger and more uncomfortable. Isaac hovered anxiously, trying to anticipate her needs, driving her slightly mad with his constant attention. "Isaac, I love you, but if you ask me one more time if I need anything, I may scream," Helena said one afternoon in late March, trying to find a comfortable position in the rocking chair Isaac had built specially for her. "I am sorry," Isaac said, looking so genuinely contrite that Helena immediately felt guilty. "No, I am sorry. I should not have snapped. I am just uncomfortable and anxious and ready for this baby to arrive." She held out her hand to him, and he came immediately, kneeling beside her chair. "What can I do?" he asked softly. "Just be here. That is all I need. Just you here with me." So Isaac stayed close as the days passed and Helena's time drew near. He had ridden down to Hangtown to fetch Mrs. Morrison, an experienced midwife who had agreed to come stay with them as Helena's due date approached. The older woman had taken one look at Isaac's terrified face and patted his arm kindly. "First baby?" she asked. "First everything," Isaac admitted. "You will do fine. And so will she. Your wife is strong, I can see that. Now, you have hot water and clean linens prepared." Isaac assured her he had everything ready, and Mrs. Morrison settled into the cabin's small guest room, seemingly unfazed by the rustic surroundings. Her presence calmed Isaac somewhat, though he still jumped at every sound Helena made. The labor began on a warm April evening, 2 days after Mrs. Morrison's arrival. Helena woke Isaac in the middle of the night, her face tight with pain. "It is time," she said simply. Isaac felt panic rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, focusing on what needed to be done. He woke Mrs. Morrison, who took charge immediately, her calm competence a steadying presence. She examined Helena, then nodded with satisfaction. "Still early yet, but progressing well. Isaac, I need you to keep the fire going and the water hot, and stay close. Your wife will need you." The next hours were the longest of Isaac's life. He sat beside Helena, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping her brow with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even as his heart threatened to beat out of his chest with fear. She was in pain, and he could do nothing to help her, could not fight this enemy or protect her from this trial. "I am here," he told her over and over. "I am right here, Helena. You are doing so well." "It hurts," Helena gasped between contractions, her face pale and sweaty. "I know, my love, I know. But Mrs. Morrison says you are doing perfectly. The baby will be here soon." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Helena's labor intensified. Mrs. Morrison positioned herself at the foot of the bed, and Isaac stayed by Helena's head, letting her grip his hands with strength that surprised him. "Almost there, Mrs. Morrison encouraged. "One more big push, dear, that is it, just like that." And then, breaking the morning silence, came the sound Isaac had been waiting for, a thin, reedy wail that grew stronger with each breath. A baby's cry. "It is a boy, Mrs. Morrison announced, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "A fine, healthy boy." She cleaned the baby quickly and expertly, then wrapped him in soft blankets and placed him in Helena's arms. Isaac stared at his son, at the tiny red face and the small fists waving in the air, and felt something break open inside him, a flood of love so intense it almost hurt. "Hello, little one," Helena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have been waiting for you." "He is perfect," Isaac managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect, both of you." "Would you like to hold him?" Helena asked, and carefully transferred the precious bundle into Isaac's arms. Isaac held his son with infinite care, terrified he would somehow hurt this tiny, fragile creature. But the baby settled against his chest, apparently unconcerned by his father's size or roughness, and Isaac felt his heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. "What shall we name him?" Helena asked, watching her husband and son with soft eyes. Isaac thought for a moment, then said, Henry James Whitmore, after your father." Helena's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Really, you want to name him after my father? He gave the world you," Isaac said simply. "That seems worth honoring." So Henry James Whitmore entered the world on an April morning in the mountains of California, welcomed by parents who had found each other against all odds and loved each other despite their differences. Mrs. Morrison stayed for a week, ensuring both mother and baby were healthy and strong before she returned to Hangtown. Isaac paid her generously, and she squeezed his hand as she left. "You are going to be a fine father," she told him. "That boy is lucky to have you." Isaac hoped she was right. He spent the first weeks of Henry's life in a state of constant vigilance, jumping at every sound the baby made, convinced that something would go wrong. But Helena was patient with his fears, showing him how to hold Henry properly, how to change his nappies, how to soothe him when he cried. "You are a natural," she told him one night as he walked the floor with Henry draped over his shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. "I am terrified," Isaac admitted. "He is so small, so fragile. He is tougher than he looks. He is your son, after all." Helena smiled at them from the bed, where she was recovering her strength. "And he already adores you. Look how he settles when you hold him." It was true. Henry seemed to find comfort in his father's large, calloused hands, would quiet when Isaac spoke in his deep, rumbling voice. As the weeks passed and Henry grew stronger and more alert, Isaac began to relax, to believe that perhaps he would not break this precious gift he had been given. They settled into new routines, their lives now revolving around the tiny person who had joined their family. Helena was an excellent mother, patient and loving, singing to Henry and reading to him from her books even though he was far too young to understand. Isaac would watch them together, his heart full to bursting, amazed that this was his life now, that he had somehow been blessed with a wife who loved him and a son who bore his name. As summer arrived, bringing warm days and cool nights, Helena announced that she wanted to return to teaching. "Not full-time," she clarified when she saw Isaac's concerned expression. "Just a few days a week. Mrs. Henderson said she would watch Henry, and I miss the children." Isaac was reluctant but understood. Teaching was part of who Helena was, and he would not ask her to give up something that brought her joy. So they arranged for Henry to stay with Mrs. Henderson, a kind widow who lived in town, while Helena taught 3 days a week. Isaac used those days to hunt and work on improvements to the cabin. adding another room that he planned to turn into a study for Helena, with proper shelves for all her books and a large window to let in the light. The seasons turned, spring becoming summer becoming autumn, and Henry grew from a tiny infant into a curious baby, then a toddler who tottered around the cabin on unsteady legs, exploring everything within reach. He had Isaac's dark hair and Helena's hazel eyes, and a fearless nature that terrified and delighted his parents in equal measure. "He is going to be a handful," Helena observed one afternoon as they watched Henry attempt to climb onto the woodpile. "He is definitely our son," Isaac agreed, scooping up the protesting toddler before he could hurt himself. Stubborn as a mule and twice as determined, but despite the challenges of raising an active child in the wilderness, Isaac had never been happier. His life had purpose and meaning beyond mere survival. He had a family, people who depended on him and loved him, and every morning he woke grateful for the gift he had been given. When Henry was 2 years old, Helena announced she was pregnant again. This time, Isaac's reaction was joy rather than fear, confidence born of experience. He knew what to expect, knew they could handle whatever came. Their daughter was born on a cold January morning, arriving quickly and easily compared to Henry's long labor. Isaac cut the cord himself this time, his hand steady, and placed the tiny girl in Helena's arms. "She looks like you," Helena said softly, studying the baby's delicate features. "Then she will be beautiful," Isaac said, kissing his wife's forehead. They named her Emma Grace, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Henry was bold and adventurous, Emma was cautious and thoughtful. Where Henry ran headlong into everything, Emma would sit and observe, her serious eyes taking in the world around her. "She is going to be the smart one," Helena predicted. "She has that look like she is figuring everything out." "She gets that from you," Isaac said. "The intelligence and the thoughtfulness." "And the stubbornness?" Helena asked with a smile. "That comes from both of us, I think." With 2 children, the cabin felt smaller but infinitely more alive. Henry adored his baby sister, though his enthusiastic attempts at helping sometimes required parental intervention. Isaac built a larger table and more chairs, added another room for the children to share, continued improving their home bit by bit. He had also continued improving himself. Isaac could now read anything Helena put in front of him, though he would never be as quick or natural a reader as she was. But he read to the children every night, his deep voice bringing stories to life, instilling in them a love of books and learning. And he wrote, painstakingly recording their family's story in a journal Helena had given him, wanting to preserve these precious years for future generations. Years passed in a blur of birthdays and holidays and small daily joys. Henry grew tall and strong, already showing signs of his father's size and strength. Emma remained small and quick, with a mind like a steel trap and her mother's love of learning. Both children could read before they started school, taught by Helena at home, and both loved the mountains where they lived, as comfortable in the wilderness as their father. When Henry was 10 and Emma was 8, Helena announced that she was pregnant once more. Isaac was surprised, as was Helena, but they welcomed the news with joy. At 34 and 36 respectively, they were older than most parents of young children, but they felt blessed by this unexpected gift. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas after the minister who had married them, arrived without complications on a bright May morning. He was a happy, easy baby content to be passed from sibling to sibling, secure in the love that surrounded him. "Our family is complete," Helena said as they lay in bed that night, Thomas sleeping peacefully in the cradle Isaac had built beside them, Henry and Emma asleep in their room down the hall. "It is perfect," Isaac agreed, his arm around his wife, his heart full. You made it perfect, Helena. You took a broken mountain man who could not read and gave him a reason to learn, a reason to live, a reason to hope. You were never broken, Helena said firmly. Wounded, perhaps, but never broken, and you gave me just as much. You showed me that love does not require polish or education, that the truest hearts can be found in the most unexpected places. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountains and the soft breathing of their children. And Isaac thought back to that day so many years ago when he had found a woman reading under a tree. He had never imagined then that she would change his entire life, would teach him not just letters but how to open his heart, how to trust, how to love without fear. The years continued to pass, each season bringing new challenges and new joys. Isaac taught his sons to hunt and track and survive in the wilderness, skills he had learned through necessity and now passed on with love. Helena taught all three children to read and write and think critically, preparing them for futures that might take them far beyond these mountains. Henry, true to his adventurous nature, announced at 18 that he wanted to join the cavalry, to see the world beyond California. Isaac, remembering his own youth and the war that had shaped him, was reluctant to let his son go into danger. But Helena reminded him gently that Henry was his own person, that they had raised him to be strong and capable and brave. He will come back, she promised Isaac as they watched Henry ride away toward his new life. This is not goodbye forever. It is just the beginning of his story. Emma, scholarly and serious, won a scholarship to a teacher's college in San Francisco. She promised to return to Hangtown after completing her education, to take over her mother's position at the school when Helena was ready to retire. Isaac was proud beyond measure, seeing his daughter follow in her mother's footsteps, bringing education and hope to those who needed it. Thomas, the youngest, seemed content to stay close to home, helping Isaac with the hunting and trapping, learning the ways of the mountains. He had his father's quiet nature and his mother's kind heart, and Isaac saw himself reflected in his youngest son, the life he might have lived if he had been blessed with a family from the start. As Isaac and Helena entered their 40s, then their 50s, they settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. Their hair began to gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work, but their love remained as strong as ever. They still read together in the evenings, Helena's head on Isaac's shoulder as he worked through whatever book she had chosen. They still took walks on Sunday afternoons, holding hands like young sweethearts. They still looked at each other with the same wonder and gratitude they had felt in the beginning. Henry returned from the cavalry after 10 years of service, bringing with him a wife and 2 children. Emma married a teacher she met in San Francisco and brought him back to Hangtown, where they taught together at the school. Thomas married a local girl, the daughter of a rancher, and built a cabin near his parents, close enough to help but far enough to have his own life. Isaac and Helena became grandparents 7 times over, their cabin filled with visiting grandchildren who loved to hear stories of how their grandfather had learned to read, how their grandmother had come west alone to teach, how love had found them both under an oak tree in the wilderness. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Isaac took Helena back to that clearing where he had proposed, the view unchanged despite all the years that had passed. They were older now, slower, but their hands still fit together perfectly as they stood looking out over the valley. "Do you have any regrets?" Isaac asked, the question that had haunted him for years finally spoken aloud. "Not a single one," Helena said without hesitation. "This life with you has been everything I could have wanted and more." You gave me adventure and love and a family, and I gave you letters and books and the same love reflected back. It was a fair trade, I think." "More than fair," Isaac said, kissing her gently. "You gave me everything." They returned to their cabin as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and sat on the porch together watching the stars come out. Inside, Thomas and his family were visiting, their laughter and conversation drifting through the open windows. Down in Hangtown, Emma was preparing lessons for her students, continuing the work her mother had started. Somewhere east, Henry was raising his children to be brave and kind, teaching them the lessons he had learned in these mountains. Isaac thought about his life, about the journey that had brought him from a lonely mountain man to a husband, father, and grandfather surrounded by love. He thought about that day he had seen Helena under the tree, how close he had come to simply walking past, to never stopping, to never taking that chance. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Helena asked, though she knew. "For seeing something in me worth teaching. For making me want to learn letters. For loving me despite everything I was not." "Thank you for being willing to learn," Helena replied. "For opening your heart despite all the reasons you had to keep it closed. For building this beautiful life with me." They sat together in the growing darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and created something lasting and true. Isaac Whitmore, who had once been alone in the wilderness, now had a legacy of love and family that would continue long after he was gone. And Helena Hughes Whitmore, who had come west seeking purpose, had found it not just in teaching children their letters, but in teaching one rough mountain man that his heart was worth sharing. The stars came out one by one, brilliant against the dark sky, and somewhere an owl called to its mate. Inside the cabin, a baby laughed, and Thomas's wife began singing a lullaby. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witness to countless stories of love and loss and hope. But none of those stories, Isaac thought as he held his wife's hand and watched the stars, could possibly be more beautiful than theirs. The mountain man and the teacher, brought together by chance and bound together by choice. Their love a testament to the transformative power of seeing and being seen, of learning and being taught, of opening your heart even when everything in your past tells you to keep it closed. As they rose to go inside, to join their family and continue the beautiful, ordinary miracle of their shared life, Isaac looked back once more at the mountains that had been his home for so long. They were still there, still wild and beautiful and eternal. But now they were not a place of exile or isolation. They were home in the truest sense, made perfect not by solitude, but by the love he shared within them. And somewhere, under an oak tree in the foothills, a book lay forgotten in the grass, its pages open to the wind, waiting for another story to begin.